The rain had just begun when Eleanor Hart stepped off a city bus in Asheville, clutching a worn satchel and an umbrella full of holes. To most, she was invisible, a secretary in the background of boardrooms, a single mother balancing bills and bedtime stories. But on one ordinary Monday morning, a single sentence buried deep in a report forced her to make a choice: stay silent or speak. What happens when an everyday woman dares to raise her voice in a room where she doesn't belong? What ripples can one small act of courage create through boardrooms, gala halls, and newspaper headlines? And what cost comes with stepping out of the shadows when powerful people would rather you stayed hidden? This is not a fairy tale. It is a story of resilience, of finding strength in ordinary moments, of a mother who refused to shrink no matter the storm. Stay with us as we follow Ellie's journey from the back row of a conference room to the front line of change. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Shining Stories, where real courage shines brightest. The rain had begun before dawn and showed no sign of letting up. By the time Eleanor Hart stepped off the city bus in downtown Asheville, her umbrella was spotted with holes and her shoes carried the damp chill of autumn sidewalks. She pulled her coat tighter, balancing her worn leather satchel on one shoulder, and reminded herself to breathe. It was Monday, quarter-end review day, and the office halls always felt heavier on mornings like this. Inside Whitaker Timber and Renewables headquarters, the lobby smelled faintly of wet wool and old coffee. Employees shook rain from their coats, folding umbrellas like tired birds before stepping into elevators. Ellie found her way to the 10th floor conference room, where the long table was already lined with steaming paper cups and folders stacked in uneven piles. She had been here for 6 years, long enough to know the rhythm of these reviews, long enough to know when to keep her head down. She slipped into her usual seat near the middle, laying out her notepad, pens, and the thick agenda packet she had printed before leaving home. The coffee she had poured 20 minutes earlier was already lukewarm. Around her, voices rose and fell in polite chatter, but beneath it ran the quiet dread that always shadowed budget meetings. People feared what numbers might erase. Ellie thumbed through the presentation slides, her eyes catching on a footnote near the bottom of the page 12. The language was clipped, almost careless. Reduce mandatory equipment training hours by 35% across regional mills. She read it twice, blinking to be sure. The words blurred as rain streaks on the window caught the overhead light. Her chest tightened. She thought of the near accident last spring, when a conveyor belt jammed at the Clay County mill and a young man nearly lost his arm. The only thing that saved him had been his quick recall of a safety drill. Less training meant more risks. And she could still hear the panic in that foreman's voice on the phone when he called to report it. Ellie's stomach churned. She knew the rule secretaries took notes. They didn't take stands. She should flag the line quietly after the meeting, send a careful email, maybe mention it to the safety director in passing. That was the expected script. But as the CFO droned on about efficiency metrics and shareholder alignment, Ellie felt her pulse climb higher than her fear. Her hand rose before her mind had caught up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "This reduction in training hours, can someone explain the rationale?" The room went still. Pens stopped moving. A dozen faces turned toward her, most of them surprised, a few disapproving. Assistants did not interrupt reviews, especially not to question budget cuts. At the head of the table, Graham Whitaker looked up from his papers. At 45, he carried the kind of presence that quieted rooms without effort. His dark suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but it was the calm weight in his eyes that made people hesitate. Ellie braced herself for dismissal, for the curt reminder that this was not her lane. Instead, he asked, "Which page?" Her fingers trembled as she turned the packet around. Page 12, the line about equipment training. He read in silence, the tick of the rain against the glass filling the pause. Then he set the paper down and looked directly at her. "You're right to raise it. Safety isn't where we cut corners." The CFO shifted uncomfortably. "It's a minor adjustment, minor until someone loses a hand." Graham interrupted. His voice carried no anger, only finality. He closed the packet and tapped it once. "This is off the table. In fact, I want a full audit of all mill safety practices, effective immediately." Murmurs rippled through the room. Graham leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Ellie will coordinate the process. She knows the field staff and has their trust. That matters here." Heat surged up Ellie's neck. Coordinator. In front of senior executives, she was supposed to type notes, not run audits. Her pen slipped in her hand, leaving a smudge on her notepad. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. The meeting moved on, numbers rolling across the screen, but Ellie's thoughts scattered. Rent was due next week. Maddie's school fundraiser had drained her grocery budget, and now her name had been pulled into the spotlight in a way she had never planned. Visibility meant risk whispers about favoritism, about ambition she didn't have time to chase. As the session adjourned, a few colleagues nodded politely. Though their eyes lingered too long, Ellie gathered her things, heart still pounding. In the hallway, she caught fragments of conversation. Bold move for a secretary. Did you see Whitaker's face? Sloan won't like this. Sloan Kerrigan. The name carried weight in Asheville's boardrooms and country clubs. Daughter of a founding investor, hostess of glossy fundraisers, sharp in every sense. If she believed Ellie was playing above her station, the whispers would grow teeth. By the time Ellie returned to her desk, the rain outside had eased, but the unease inside her chest had not. She tucked her satchel under the chair and tried to lose herself in routine tasks, email follow-ups, calendar adjustments, a call from Maddie's teacher about next month's art show, normal things, safe things. But when her computer chimed just after 5, she froze. A new meeting invite glowed on her screen. Follow-up on audit scope Graham Whitaker. Tomorrow. 7:30, more. Private conference room. Ellie stared at the words, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Her stomach flipped, a mixture of dread and something harder to name. She had drawn a line she never meant to cross, and the CEO had not only noticed he had chosen her to carry it forward. Outside, the rain picked up again, soft against the glass. The calendar invite had sat on her screen all night like an unanswered question. Ellie barely slept, her thoughts running in circles between grocery lists, overdue bills, and the echo of Graham Whitaker's voice declaring she would coordinate the audit. By morning, the gray rain had lifted, but her nerves hadn't. She arrived early, satchel pressed against her side, and walked the quiet corridor to the private conference room. The door stood slightly ajar. She tapped once, then slipped inside. Graham was already there, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked less like the imposing figure at the head of the boardroom table, and more like a man deep in thought, coffee cooling beside a stack of papers. "Thank you for coming." "Ellie," he said simply, motioning toward a chair. Her pulse raced. She braced for a reprimand, perhaps a reminder to know her place. Instead, he leaned forward, hands clasped, and outlined something she hadn't imagined. He wanted her to serve as community and safety liaison for the next 6 weeks, a bridge between headquarters and the mills, someone the crews would trust, someone who could translate numbers into stories. It wasn't just about audits. It was about repairing trust in a company that had been accused too often of caring more for profit than people. Ellie sat very still, letting the words settle. The title sounded temporary, maybe even fragile, but the responsibility was real. She thought of the men and women at the mills, of the phone calls she'd taken after near misses, of how much difference it would make if their voices reached the top. But she also thought of Maddie, of homework spread across the kitchen table, of bedtime stories, of Friday night pizza on the couch. Visibility meant evening dinners, weekend events, rumors. It meant being away when Maddie still needed her close. She cleared her throat. "If I do this, it has to be on clear terms." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "I need a written scope." She continued. "No surprises. Notice for any travel or events, enough time to arrange childcare. And my evenings with Maddie are protected, non-negotiable. She's 9. She still needs me home. Her voice was calm, but her palms were damp against her skirt. She expected pushback. She expected the faintly amused smile men sometimes wore when women set boundaries. Instead, Graham nodded once, as if she had said the most sensible thing in the world. Done, he said, all of it. The simplicity startled her. She leaned back slightly, studying him. He wasn't humoring her. His expression was steady, respectful, as if the conditions only confirmed his choice. Then came the first collision. He mentioned a donor dinner scheduled for the same Thursday as Maddie's school art show. Her heart sank. Maddie had been working on her project for weeks, tiny mosaics of leaves and paint, her proudest creation yet. Ellie would not miss it. Before she could voice the conflict, Graham opened his calendar. We'll move the dinner to an hour later. The donors can wait. Family comes first. Ellie stared. She had expected negotiation, maybe an apology for the inconvenience. Not this. The adjustment seemed small to him, but to her it was seismic. He was willing to bend his schedule around hers, not the other way around. Still, doubt lingered. If she stepped into this role, she would be more visible than ever. She could almost hear the whispers already. The secretary with sudden influence. Sloane will have a field day. She pictured Sloane Kerrigan's sharp smile, the way she carried herself at board functions, the power she wielded without lifting her voice. If Sloane decided Ellie was a problem, the consequences could be swift. That evening, Ellie carried the weight of the decision home. Maddie was sprawled on the floor, coloring while the smell of tomato soup filled their small kitchen. Mrs. Ruth Nolan knocked softly before letting herself in with her spare key. She carried a basket of cornbread wrapped in a towel, her eyes crinkling with kindness. "You've got that thinking face." "Ellie," Ruth said, settling into a chair. "The one you wore when you first brought that baby home and weren't sure you could keep the lights on." Ellie laughed faintly, stirring the soup. "It's a work thing. Complicated." Ruth waited. She had been a school secretary for 40 years. She knew when silence would draw truth out. Ellie explained haltingly at first about the offer, the conditions, the risks. Ruth listened without interruption, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Ellie finished, Ruth nodded once. "Sounds to me like courage with guardrails," she said. "You don't need to leap without a net. You just need to know your worth and hold the line." Ellie exhaled, tension slipping from her shoulders. Ruth's words didn't erase the risks, but they reframed them. Courage with guardrails. She could live with that. Later, after Maddie was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet, Ellie opened her laptop. The cursor blinked on Graham's meeting request. She clicked, accept. She closed the screen, pressing her palms together. First test ahead, the Blue Ridge Heritage Gala. A world of magnolia-scented rooms and people who measured worth by last names. Her closet said no, but something in her spine whispered, maybe, Mrs. Ruth Nolan's apartment smelled faintly of cedar and lavender. Ellie had spent many evenings there over the years, usually perched at the small kitchen table, while Ruth shared stories of long-ago school days. But tonight, the older woman guided her past the kitchen and into a narrow hallway closet. The air was cool, lined with the soft hush of old fabric and the faint scent of mothballs. "This isn't magic, child," Ruth said, pulling aside a garment bag with hands that still moved steadily despite her age. "But sometimes all a woman needs is one piece that reminds her she belongs." From the bag, she lifted a navy dress, simple but elegant, with sleeves that skimmed the elbow and a hem that brushed just below the knee. Ellie brushed her fingers over the fabric. It wasn't silk, not couture, but the weave had a quiet dignity. Ruth laid it across the bed and brought out a pair of low black heels. "Polish those, and they'll shine just fine." Ellie spent the next hour in Ruth's small apartment, steaming wrinkles from the dress, buffing the shoes until they reflected the lamplight, and pinning a loose hem with careful fingers. Ruth watched from her rocker, offering advice only when asked, The work itself felt grounding small acts of care, each one layering calm over the storm in Ellie's chest. When the dress was ready, Ruth opened another drawer and drew out a shawl. It was soft wool, woven in muted grays and blues, the kind of piece that carried history. My mother wore this to her first church social after the war, Ruth said. She always said it kept her steady when she felt out of place. Maybe it'll do the same for you. Ellie accepted it with reverence. She slipped it around her shoulders, feeling the weight settle like a blessing. Back at her duplex, Maddie sat cross-legged on the living room rug, surrounded by construction paper and glue sticks. She looked up with wide eyes. Will there be music, mama-like violins? Maybe, Ellie said, kneeling to tuck a stray curl behind her daughter's ear. But I promise you photos and a hug the moment I get home. Maddie nodded, satisfied. She didn't ask the bigger questions: why her mother needed a dress when she usually wore slacks, why her boss suddenly cared about her being seen. Children had a way of sensing what to leave unspoken. Ellie set the dress aside and turned to her work. The next morning's hours were filled with phone calls to mill foremen, her voice steady as she scheduled safety drills. She sent texts to line workers she had known for years, assuring them the audit was real, that their concerns mattered. The replies came back quickly, brief but warm. Trust had been built in quiet conversations long before today. By afternoon, the dress hung pressed and ready. Ellie stood before her mirror, practicing posture, rolling her shoulders back, lifting her chin. She rehearsed eye contact, the rhythm of steady breathing, the way to hold silence without apology. Confidence, she realized, could be practiced like scales on a piano. Not natural, maybe, but learned until it became second nature. Evening crept in. The rain that had threatened all week softened to a mist. Ellie dressed slowly, slipping into the navy fabric, fastening a pair of earrings she had worn to Maddie's baptism. She polished her nails clear, added a touch of blush. Nothing extravagant, just enough to reflect the effort. Finally, she draped the shawl over her shoulders. The wool carried the faint cedar of Ruth's closet, and with it, a reminder that she didn't walk into this night alone. She glanced once more at Maddie, already in pajamas, curled up with a book on the couch. Ellie bent to kiss her forehead. "Be good for Mrs. Nolan," she whispered. Maddie's sleepy hand clung to hers for a heartbeat longer, then let go. At the doorway, Ellie paused, one world behind her soup pots, homework, the hum of an old refrigerator. Another world ahead, chandeliers, polished floors, conversations where every word might be measured. She felt the divide in her bones. She pulled the shawl tighter, steadying herself against the cool air. The mist had stopped, leaving the streetlights haloed in silver. As she stepped onto the porch, headlights swept the curb, bright against the dark. Somewhere beyond the hills, estate lights glowed, waiting for her arrival. And for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt her spine straighten, not from fear, but from a quiet kind of readiness. The Biltmore estate had always seemed like another world to Ellie. She had passed its gates on school field trips, seen photographs of weddings held beneath its arches, but never imagined stepping into its vaulted halls as a guest. Tonight, magnolia blossoms perfumed the air, their sweetness mixing with candlelight and the low hum of strings rising from a corner orchestra. The scale was overwhelming, the ceilings impossibly high, and everywhere she turned, eyes seemed to measure whether she belonged. Ellie moved carefully through the reception hall, letting Graham take the lead with introductions. She shook hands when offered, smiled politely, and listened more than she spoke. Her instinct told her to blend, to be unremarkable, yet every glance reminded her that silence would not serve her here. She steadied herself with small anchors, her shawl against her shoulders. The cool weight of her grandmother's bracelet around her wrist, the practiced rhythm of her breathing. The first questions were casual enough compliments on her dress, polite queries about her role, but soon the tone shifted. A silver-haired donor leaned in, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw nearby attention. "We keep hearing about injuries in the mills. Hard to square with the profit reports. What's really happening on the ground? Ellie felt her chest tighten, but she remembered the faces of the workers she had spoken with just days ago. She answered plainly, "There have been incidents. Yes, that's why we're increasing training drills, not cutting them. I've spoken with the crews myself. They know the procedures save lives." The donor seemed surprised, perhaps expecting deflection. His nod carried a grudging respect. Another guest pressed about layoffs, asking if the company could survive without trimming its workforce. Ellie did not offer numbers she didn't have. Instead, she spoke about the people she did know, the veteran foreman who had trained 3 generations of workers, the single father saving for his daughter's college tuition. She framed the questions not as abstractions, but as lives that mattered. Not everyone was pleased. She felt it before she saw it, the calculated presence of Sloane Kerrigan, draped in silk the color of champagne. Sloane crossed the floor with the grace of someone who had ruled these circles since birth. Her smile was precise, a weapon polished by practice. "Well, Eleanor," Sloane said, drawing out the name as if trying it on for size. "Whitaker has always attracted strong voices. Tell me, what school did you attend?" The words seemed harmless, but Ellie heard the undertone. Not which degree, not what subject, just whether her pedigree matched the room. Ellie met her gaze, steady but unembellished. "State College in Raleigh. I worked nights to finish my degree." The smile on Sloane's lips didn't reach her eyes. How admirable. Ellie's fingers tightened around her clutch. Doubt whispered at her ear, but before she could falter, Graham spoke. His tone was clear, firm, carrying easily across the gathering. "Ellie's been leading our audit preparations," he said. "She's already identified gaps and scheduled drills that are making a difference in real time. Results matter more than pedigrees." A ripple of approval spread through the circle. Some clapped lightly. Others murmured agreement. Ellie felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from shame, but from the startling weight of support. And then it happened. A woman stepped forward from the edge of the group, a mill worker's spouse, dressed simply but with quiet dignity. Her voice trembled slightly, but her words rang strong. "My husband says thank you," she told Ellie. "He came home last week talking about the new safety drills. He said folks feel like someone finally listened. That matters more to us than you know." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. Ellie's throat tightened. She had walked into this night fearing she would be an imposter among magnolia and chandeliers. Yet validation had come not through glamour, not through Graham's title, but through the voice of a family who had felt seen. For the first time, Ellie allowed herself to let praise land without apology. She did not shrink. She did not wave it away. She nodded, accepted it, and held the moment quietly. The evening continued, conversations weaving in and out, but something had shifted. She no longer felt like an intruder. She was there because she carried truths that mattered, truths no ballroom could erase. Still, not every face in the room reflected approval. Near the bar, Ellie noticed the cost-focused VP, his glass of bourbon untouched, his gaze sharp and calculating. He did not clap when others did. Instead, he scribbled something onto a folded napkin, as if already drafting a memo. Ellie's heart steadied. For every person who welcomed her voice, another would test it. Tonight was only the beginning. She drew her shawl closer, sensing headlights waiting outside the estate, the cool night air that would greet her when she left. Beyond the hills, more challenges were already forming. The damage seldom arrived with headlines or breaking news. It slipped in quietly, like a paper cut barely noticed at first, until it stung with every movement. That was how Ellie saw it when she opened a neglected report buried deep in the audit files. The document listed outdated saw guards at 2 regional mills, their replacement marked as pending. The date in the corner told a harsher truth pending for nearly 3 years. She flagged the report, highlighted the risks, and forwarded it with a note to the cost-focused VP. The reply came an hour later, curt and dismissive. "Budget allocation under review. We'll revisit next quarter. That meant months. Months in which one jammed blade or loose guard could maim a worker. Ellie stared at the email, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, her jaw tightening. She wanted to march into his office, but she also knew how the hierarchy worked. People who pushed too hard, too fast, often found themselves sidelined. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with bills spread across the surface, sticky notes marking due dates. Maddie's lunchbox sat open beside them, half-packed with apple slices and crackers. A pot of soup cooled on the stove. This was the quiet heroism of routine balancing numbers, keeping a household afloat, making sure her daughter never felt the edges of the struggle. Ellie rubbed her temples. Her body felt heavy from the gala, from the eyes that measured her, from the responsibility that seemed to grow heavier with every file she opened. She wrote checks slowly, as if stretching each dollar could also stretch her breath. From the next room, she heard a whimper, Maddie's voice, soft but strained. Ellie pushed back her chair and hurried in. Her daughter sat upright in bed, hair damp with sweat, eyes wide. "I heard you on the phone," Maddie whispered. "Something about machines. Someone getting hurt." Ellie sat beside her, smoothing the tangled hair back from her forehead. "It's just work, baby, grown-up things. Nothing for you to worry about. But you sounded scared." Ellie's throat tightened. She pulled Maddie close, rocking gently. "I get scared sometimes, too," she admitted. "But scared doesn't mean something bad will happen. It just means we pay attention. And then we make it safer." Maddie relaxed against her, though her small body still trembled. Ellie hummed the lullaby she had sung since infancy, the one that wrapped both of them in borrowed calm. Slowly, Maddie's breathing steadied, and she drifted back to sleep. Ellie sat there longer, staring into the dim glow of the nightlight. She thought about what courage looked like, not loud speeches or dramatic acts, but the quiet choice to keep showing up, even when fear pressed close. Across town, Graham stood alone in a quiet hallway of company headquarters. The office had emptied hours ago, but he lingered, one hand resting on a wooden plaque mounted to the wall. It bore the names of workers lost in an accident decades earlier, long before his tenure. He traced the letters slowly, silently. He never spoke about it, but Ellie noticed the way his expression shifted when safety reports crossed his desk. Some weight lived in him, tethering his resolve. The next morning, Ellie drafted an escalation memo. She stacked the facts in neat order dates, inspection notes, manufacturer recalls. Each line was precise, unadorned, but the message carried a current of compassion. These weren't just machines. They were the hands and lives of people she knew by name. She hesitated before sending it. Once the memo left her desk, it couldn't be ignored. It would circulate beyond the VP, into inboxes of directors, maybe even the board. It was a risk. She pressed send anyway. Hours later, her phone buzzed with an incoming message. A foreman from the Clay County mill had attached photos. Grainy images showed saw guards cracked and bent, barely holding shape. The captions were brief but urgent. "This is what we're working with. We can't wait another quarter." Ellie felt a rush of vindication mixed with dread. The images made the stall impossible. If ignored, they could become evidence in a courtroom, not just an email thread. She forwarded the photos with her memo, adding only 4 words: delay no longer an option. For a moment, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She thought of Maddie's nightmare, of the workers' voices, of Graham's steady hand on the plaque. The line she had crossed weeks ago now stretched further, and she walked it willingly. Still, she knew pushback would come. People who prized profit margins rarely welcomed hard truths. And she was right. That evening, as she packed up to leave, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from the mills. It was from a local reporter. The subject line read, "Comment requests new liaison role at Whitaker. Questions about optics." Ellie's stomach dropped. The wind was shifting. What had started as quiet work might soon play out under public scrutiny. She closed her laptop slowly, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows on wet pavement. Tomorrow would bring questions she had not yet prepared to answer. The paper landed with a thud on Ellie's porch, just as the coffee maker sputtered in her kitchen. She didn't usually read the print edition, but this morning, the headline reached her before she could look away. Secretary turned Liaison Whitaker's PR move, or something more. Her breath caught. Beneath the bold type, a smaller line suggested her new role was less about safety and more about optics. The photograph showed her at the gala, shawl draped over her shoulders, eyes caught mid-blink beside Graham Whitaker's steady frame. To strangers, it looked like something it wasn't. Ellie folded the paper quickly, but the words had already burned into her chest. She carried her mug to the table, hands trembling just enough to spill a line of coffee across the newsprint. The bitter scent rose as she blotted it with a napkin, wishing she could blot away the headline just as easily. Online, the story spread faster. By the time she logged in for work, comments were already trickling onto social media. Of course, the secretary gets promoted when the boss is single. PR cover-up at its finest. The words stung more than the coffee she had burned her tongue on. At school pickup that afternoon, whispers floated in the line of parents. A woman in a bright red jacket leaned toward another, voice pitched just low enough to pretend it's secrecy. Guess some people know how to get ahead. Maddie looked up at her mother, sensing tension without needing to understand. She slipped her hand into Ellie's, holding tighter than usual. Ellie squeezed back, forcing a smile. Long day, she murmured, though the ache in her chest had little to do with hours worked. Back at headquarters, Graham called her into his office. She braced for reassignment, for the polite suggestion to step back until the gossip cooled. Instead, he gestured to a stack of signed orders. Equipment upgrades approved, he said. Every mill, no more delays. Ellie blinked. Even with the press, especially with the press, he cut in. His tone carried a finality that left no room for doubt. We don't hide when people are watching. We show the truth. Then he outlined something bolder, a public safety forum, open to workers and their families. With union representatives present, Ellie would moderate. Her stomach dropped. Public speaking had never been her aim, but Graham's eyes held steady confidence. "You're the one they trust," he said simply. The days leading up to the forum passed in a blur of logistics, venue booking, questions drafted, coordination with union reps. Ellie's name appeared on flyers posted at mill entrances, another reminder that she had become visible in ways she never sought. Meanwhile, Sloane Kerrigan was not idle. Ellie overheard her in a hallway, voice cool as glass. "Charleston's board reception is no place for experiments. We can't risk distracting optics." The word optics sliced sharper than the headline had. Ellie carried the wound home, where Mrs. Nolan was waiting with a pot of stew. The older woman ladled steaming broth into bowls, then fixed Ellie with a knowing look. "Child, you're walking around like someone stole your name," she said. Ellie sighed, wrapping her hands around the warm bowl. "It feels like they're not seeing me. Just a story they wrote instead." Ruth shook her head. "People will always talk. That's their work. Yours is different. The work speaks louder if you let it. Don't hand your voice over to gossip." Ellie let the words sink in. Courage with guardrails, Ruth had said before. Tonight, it felt like another reminder to stand steady even when the ground shifted. The night of the forum arrived cool and crisp. Families filled the community hall, their coats steaming faintly from the autumn air. Union reps sat near the front, clipboards ready. Workers lined the aisles, some with children on their laps, others with hands scarred from years at the machines. Ellie stood at the podium, palms damp against the wood. For a moment, the chatter blurred, the headlines echoed. Then she caught sight of a familiar face, a foreman, who had once called her in panic about a jammed conveyor. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if to say, "You belong here." Her voice steadied. She opened the forum, inviting questions, inviting stories. One by one, people spoke. A young mother described her fear each time her husband left for the night shift. An older worker recalled the day training drills had saved his apprentice from a shattered blade. Their words filled the hall with a weight no headline could carry. Graham sat near the back, silent but attentive. He didn't interrupt, didn't overshadow. He let Ellie hold the space, and she did. She listened, responded, and guided the conversation with the same calm she used to settle Maddie after nightmares. By the end of the night, applause rose not for a company, not for a CEO, but for the shared promise that safety mattered. Families felt heard, workers felt seen. And Ellie, standing at the podium, realized her presence had recalibrated the narrative. When the last chair was folded and the hall emptied, she stepped outside. The sky was heavy with clouds, rain scent on the wind. Graham joined her on the steps, offering no speech, only a steady glance that carried respect. The forecast promised storms. A field visit to the toughest mill in the hills was scheduled next. Ellie pulled her shawl close, bracing against the coming rain. The morning began in silence, broken only by the steady tick of windshield wipers. Fog rolled low across the Blue Ridge, soft as breath, wrapping the road in shifting veils. Ellie cradled a thermos between her palms, steam curling upward as the miles passed. Beside her, Graham kept his eyes on the road, his profile etched in the dim light. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The rhythm of the wipers, the faint rattle of gravel under the tires, the shared warmth of coffee passed back and forth, it all carried more weight than conversation could. The mill sat at the end of a winding two-lane, its corrugated walls gleaming faintly with dew. Workers gathered in clusters, jackets zipped against the chill. Ellie recognized faces, men and women she had spoken with over the years by phone. Today, they greeted her with nods that held a new kind of respect. She had been the one who fought for drills like this. And now, in the midst of a mountain morning, they were putting those drills into motion. She watched as crews lined up, reviewed safety protocols, and executed step-by-step responses. The precision was striking. Hands moved quickly, voices steady, eyes sharp. What had once been routine paperwork now played out in real time, and Ellie felt her throat tighten with pride. A clipboard passed between her and Graham, their fingers brushing briefly. The contact was nothing accidental, fleeting, but the jolt it carried lingered longer than it should have. Later, they found themselves under the same awning as rain began to fall, shoulders nearly touching, the scent of wet pine rising around them. When one of the younger workers cracked a joke about the rain, they both laughed at the same instant. The sound startled Ellie. It wasn't forced or polite, but real, shared. For a moment, the line between colleague and something else blurred. During a lull, Graham asked about Maddie. The question was simple, but his attention made it feel different. Ellie told him about the art project her daughter had been working on, a mural of leaves and colors glued piece by piece into a forest scene. Graham listened with the same intensity he gave to board presentations. A week later, Maddie would find an envelope in her school fund, anonymous but generous. Inside was enough money to buy brushes, paints, and paper for every child in her class. Ellie would know exactly who had given it, though Graham never said a word. His care showed up not in speeches, but in actions that left no trace but kindness. It both steadied and unsettled her. Midday, the drills were interrupted by a sharp cry. A jammed saw had sent wood splintering, startling a crewman. For a moment, Ellie's heart stopped. She saw the accident before it could happen. But then, just as quickly, the workers moved into the very drill she had pushed to restore. Power cut, guard engaged, first aid at the ready. Within seconds, the danger passed. The air hung heavy after, everyone realizing what might have been. One foreman turned to Ellie, his face pale. "If we hadn't drilled this," his voice broke off. Ellie swallowed hard. She caught Graham's gaze across the floor. He didn't smile, didn't nod, but the look they shared carried more than words. Proof, vindication, relief. The training had mattered. Her insistence had mattered. As the day wound down, the workers dispersed, boots crunching over wet gravel. Ellie and Graham walked back to the truck in silence, both carrying the weight of what had almost happened and the quiet gratitude of what had not. On the drive back, the fog thickened again, wrapping the road in muted gray. Ellie sat with her hands folded over the thermos, heart still racing from the near miss. She wanted to speak, to name what she felt, but the words lodged somewhere deep. Graham drove with steady hands, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed forward. Whatever passed between them remained unspoken, but it pulsed like a current in the quiet. When they reached town, headlights caught the edge of a billboard advertising the upcoming Charleston Board weekend. Invitations, seating charts, and the currents of social politics already loomed. The work was not slowing. If anything, the stakes were rising. Ellie rested her head back against the seat, eyes closing briefly. She knew the rain would follow them into Charleston, not the literal kind, but the kind that tested whether a person could stay upright when the storm broke. For now, she let the rhythm of the wipers carry her home. Charleston greeted them with salt air and the hush of tides against the harbor wall. Cobblestone streets glistened from a passing rain, and gas lamps flickered along rows of historic brick facades. The city carried a dignity that liked to decide who belonged and who did not. Ellie felt it in the set of doormen's shoulders, in the watchful glances of women dressed in pearls passed down like heirlooms. The reception hall overlooked the water, wide windows open to the scent of the sea. Conservation donors mingled with board members, their voices rising in polite laughter that masked the sharper edges beneath. Ellie stood near the entrance at first, letting Graham move through the room with the ease of someone bred to these circles. She smoothed her navy dress, a simple, classic cut Ruth had helped her press, and reminded herself she was not here to perform. Sloane Kerrigan arrived like a tide that swept others in her wake. Champagne silk, diamonds at her ears, and a smile sharpened for battle. It took her only minutes to corner Ellie by a tray of oysters. Her tone sweet, but her eyes cool. "So, Eleanor," Sloane began, "I was just telling someone about my grandfather's class at Yale. Such a legacy. I imagine your family had its own fine traditions." Ellie felt the question land like a net. Pedigree talk, a quiet sorting game. She lifted her chin, steady but unadorned. "My folks ran a hardware store outside Raleigh. I put myself through state college, nights and weekends." The silence that followed stretched thin. Sloane's smile froze, then flickered. A few listeners shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to admire Ellie's candor or dismiss it. Ellie did not flinch. She let the truth stand, plain and unembellished. In that stillness, she realized her strength was not in pretending to be what she was not, but in refusing to shrink from what she was. Later, as the evening settled into speeches, Graham stepped to the front, his voice carried without effort, calm and deliberate. He spoke of safety, of rebuilding trust, of the workers who carried the company's future. Then he paused, scanning the room. "Tonight," he said, "I am establishing a worker family fund. It will support emergency needs medical bills, school costs, unexpected crises, and I am seeding it with my own year-end bonus." The words rippled through the hall. Conversation stilled. Some faces registered surprise, others approval. What had begun as philanthropy now edged into policy, setting a precedent no board member could easily dismiss. Ellie watched the recalibration happen in real time. Donors who had been leaning toward Sloane's orbit now tilted toward Graham. Applause rose, genuine and sustained, and in that moment, Sloane's narrative that Ellie was a symbol, a distraction, began to fray. The fund reframed the company's heart in public, grounding it not in optics, but in substance. Ellie stood at the edge of the crowd, her shawl folded neatly in her hands. She did not step forward, did not claim credit. Quiet grace was its own kind of presence. She chose to own her lane, not shrinking, not straining to shine, simply standing as herself. When the reception ended, she walked out into the Charleston night, the harbor breeze cool against her skin. Bells from a distant church tower chimed the hour, carrying across the cobblestones. Graham joined her on the steps, offering no speech, only a brief glance that acknowledged everything without naming it. Behind them, the hall buzzed with aftershocks. Ahead of them, the road stretched toward the airport. A late flight west waited, bound for Seattle, where questions would cut deeper and answers would need to stand taller. Ellie drew the salt air into her lungs, steadying herself. She had held her ground. She had seen policy turn in real time. Yet she knew this was only another threshold, not the destination. The rain had passed for now, but storms brewed on the horizon. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled, leaving only a wash of soft blue across the rows. Through the window, Ellie saw the faint outline of mountains fading into black water below. The day had been long, heavy with Charleston's echoes, but here, at 30,000 feet, the world narrowed to the steady hum of engines and the space between two seats. Graham sat beside her, jacket folded neatly over his lap, eyes closed though she doubted he slept. He carried silence differently than most men she had known, less like a wall, more like a room you could enter without asking. She leaned back against her headrest, letting the quiet stretch. After a time, she spoke, her voice low. "I nearly quit last year." His eyes opened, turning toward her. She kept her gaze on the window, watching lights scatter across the coastline. Maddie got sick, nothing serious. But the appointments piled up. I felt like I was drowning. I told myself I'd find a smaller job, something that fit in the cracks. But then, she hesitated, searching for the thread. I couldn't. I wanted her to see me stand. The admission hung in the air, soft but unflinching. Graham was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice carried the weight of something he rarely shared. "I have a ritual," he said. "Whenever I pass the old memorial plaque in the headquarters hall, I read the names, every one of them. I don't rush it. Sometimes I whisper them. Reminds me why the numbers matter, why the margins don't tell the whole story." Ellie turned then, studying him in the dim light. His expression was unguarded, almost raw. The thought of him alone in a hallway, reciting names like prayer, carved a place in her chest she hadn't known was waiting. The rest of the flight passed in companionable quiet. They shared the thermos again, lukewarm now, each sip a wordless gesture. She realized how different this was from every other time she had sat next to a man on a plane. No performance, no small talk filling the air, just the simple comfort of being near. When they landed, the hour was late, the terminal nearly empty. The hotel shuttle carried them through Seattle's damp streets, neon lights reflecting off wet pavement. Ellie's exhaustion pressed heavy, but beneath it, anticipation hummed. The Clean Energy Forum loomed 3 days of panels, questions, and eyes waiting for someone to falter. In the hotel, they walked down the hallway side by side, luggage wheels whispering over carpet. Their rooms were adjoining, doors only a few feet apart. At her threshold, Ellie paused, fingers tightening on the handle. Graham stopped too. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them was charged, a pull both undeniable and dangerous. She felt it in the breath they shared, in the way his hand hovered as if to reach for hers. 1,000 choices rushed through her mind. What if? What now? What next? But then, slowly, he stepped back. His voice was quiet, almost a murmur. "Good night, Ellie?" She nodded, throat tight. "Good night." She slipped inside her room, closing the door with care. On the other side, she heard the faint click of his own door shutting. Boundaries honored, longing unspoken. The near miss was not an accident, but a choice. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, staring at the city lights beyond the glass. She knew the story she was living had changed shape again tonight, not because of declarations or gestures, but because of what was withheld. Respect had its own gravity, and it steadied even as it unsettled. She thought of Maddie's laugh, of Ruth's counsel, of the workers who had trusted her voice, and now of Graham, who seemed to believe in her without needing to say it. The mix of fear and comfort settled over her like the rain outside, persistent, undeniable, but cleansing in its own way. On the desk, the forum schedule waited. Tomorrow, the microphones would be live. Panelists known for blunt questions were already in town, sharpening their angles. Ellie drew a deep breath. Truth would be asked of her, and she would need to decide how much of herself to give. For now, she leaned back against the pillows, letting the hum of the city fill the silence. Longing could wait for daylight. Work, purpose, and honesty would claim the morning. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the faint reflection of her own face in the window glass, tired, yes, but steady. A woman on the edge of something larger than she had imagined, yet grounded enough to walk into it. The Seattle Grand Hall gleamed with glass and steel, a space built to impress. Rows of chairs stretched beneath chandeliers that looked like frozen waterfalls, while cameras tracked every movement from their perches. Ellie sat on stage beside Graham, her pulse loud in her ears, her palms damp against the paper folder resting in her lap. The panel began with polite exchanges, safe questions about sustainability targets and renewable investments. But the air shifted when one of the moderators leaned forward, voice carrying an edge. "Let's get to what everyone's been whispering," he said. "Isn't this just optics? A secretary turned savior good press while real issues remain." The words sliced through the room. Murmurs rose, cameras zoomed in, and Ellie felt every eye tilt toward her. The smear article had followed her here, given new life under brighter lights. She braced for Graham to deflect, to wrap the truth in corporate polish. Instead, he leaned toward the microphone, his tone calm but clear. Radical transparency. He began, "That's what we promised. So here it is." He outlined the audit findings in stark detail. Outdated saw guards, neglected training, the very risks Ellie had flagged on day one. He explained the upgrades already implemented, the drills now saving lives. The Worker Family Fund launched in Charleston. Each fact landed heavy, undeniable. And credit, he added, pausing just long enough for silence to fall, goes to Eleanor Hart. She stood up when cuts were on the table. She insisted on seeing people, not just numbers. Without that voice, the changes you see today would not exist. The room stilled. Ellie's breath caught. It was one thing to be defended in private, another to be named in front of hundreds of journalists, donors, investors. Her cheeks warmed, but her spine straightened. Across the stage, a board proxy tied to Sloan tapped rapidly on his phone. A buzz of a message reached Graham's screen. Ellie glimpsed the words as he angled the device away. "Donor fallout if you blur lines. Step back or risk it all." For a heartbeat. She thought he might soften, might pivot to safer ground. Instead, Graham slid the phone face down and returned to the microphone. "My reputation," he said, voice steady, "is worth nothing if it isn't tied to ethics. This company will stand for its people. If donors object, then they are welcome to take their money elsewhere." The declaration landed like a strike. The temperature of the room shifted. Skepticism bent toward respect, the air thick with recalibration. Some panelists leaned back, reassessing. The moderator nodded once, surprised but satisfied. Ellie exhaled, tension leaving her body in waves. In that moment, she realized Graham hadn't just defended her. He had staked his standing, his influence, his future on the choice to center truth over convenience. The session closed to applause that grew louder than expected, not thunderous, but genuine enough to signal that the narrative had turned, not optics, not rumor, integrity. Later, on the terrace overlooking the water, the city stretched in lights across the sound. Ferries drifted like quiet lanterns, their beams cutting gentle lines across the dark waves. Ellie leaned against the railing, the night air cool against her skin. Graham joined her. No cameras now, no microphones, only the sound of gulls and the hush of the tide. For a while, they stood in silence, letting the noise of the day wash away. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't have to say my name." "I did." He answered, "Because it's true." The words were simple, but they unlocked something, not because of grand gestures, but because of the steadiness behind them. Ellie turned, meeting his gaze in the soft glow of terrace lights. The look they shared carried the weight of months, fights fought together, boundaries honored, care shown in small actions. It was not sudden. It had been growing quietly, like roots deepening beneath soil until strong enough to break through. When he reached for her, it wasn't hurried. The embrace was steady, deliberate, chosen. His arms around her felt less like conquest, more like a vow. She let herself rest against him, the truth of their connection no longer hidden in half glances or unspoken words. For the first time, public integrity had unlocked private truth. They stood there until the chill deepened, until the fairy lights blurred into the horizon. When they finally stepped back, the air between them felt changed, charged with something both fragile and unshakable. Ellie knew what came next would not be easy. Integrity always carried cost. They would have to reorder their lives to hold it at work, at home, with Maddie, with the world watching. But for now, under the Seattle sky, she allowed herself one breath of peace, a moment of love recognized not as fantasy, but as the natural consequence of standing for what mattered. No chandeliers, no microphones, just the smell of pancakes rising in a skillet and the soft scrape of a spatula against cast iron. Tuesday morning came without fanfare, yet it held more weight than any ballroom Ellie had ever stepped into. The independent auditors released their report that week, progress validated, safety drills documented, equipment upgrades confirmed. Even the union representatives, cautious for months, signed a cooperative memorandum that spoke of partnership instead of suspicion. For the first time in years, workers felt change wasn't just promised, but practiced. Ellie's role shifted too. An email went company-wide. Effective immediately, Eleanor Hart will serve as Director of Community Safety, reporting to the Audit Committee. This alignment ensures independence and transparency. Her name sat in bold, not buried in a footnote. It meant she would no longer answer directly to Graham. That boundary mattered. It was structure, not distance protection for both of them. At home, life carried its own rhythm. Maddie tugged at her sleeve as Ellie flipped pancakes, eager to show off the latest stage of her mural. Paper spread across the table, glue sticks scattered like crayons, leaves cut from construction paper layered into forests of color, each branch reaching for the next. When Graham arrived, Maddie studied him with the seriousness of a child deciding whether to allow entry. He didn't press. He crouched beside the table, asked about her trees, and listened as though the art carried the weight of policy. When she offered him a brush, he rinsed it carefully in the jar, shaking off water with the same care he might give to crystal stemware. He didn't take over. He left the room for Ellie's lead. Later, Mrs. Nolan stopped by with her basket of folded laundry, as she often did on Tuesdays. She watched Graham hand Maddie a napkin, listened to their quiet exchange about colors. Anne nodded once, her approval understated. Kindness, she said to Ellie in the kitchen. That's what counts. Not the size of a gesture, but the steadiness of it. The Worker Family Fund began its first projects that week too. A scholarship for a line worker's son. Medical support for a widow still paying bills from an old injury. Each act chipped away at the narrative Sloan had tried to shape. Influence shifted slowly but surely. Conversations in donor circles turned toward results, not lineage. For the first time, Sloan's smile seemed to reach fewer eyes. That evening, the apartment filled with the scent of syrup and tempera paint, plates stacked in the sink, brushes drying on towels, and Maddie humming as she pieced together the last section of her mural. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't staged, but it was real. Ellie looked across the table at Graham. He wasn't larger than life in that moment. He was simply a man folding napkins, sleeves rolled back, listening to a child talk about leaf shapes. And somehow, that was proof enough. The climax didn't come with applause or spotlight. It came in the ordinary day, in the quiet realization that love, true love, never asked her to shrink. It didn't demand she trade her voice for affection. It grew alongside her work, her motherhood, her independence. As night fell, Ellie stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of rain, the light above her door casting a warm circle on the steps. Graham joined her, Maddie already asleep inside. They didn't need to speak much. Hope lived in the silence, in the shared awareness that tomorrow would still bring work and weather, but tonight they had steadiness. Ellie pulled her shawl around her shoulders, feeling the wool against her skin. She thought of where she had begun papers buried in reports, fear of being seen. And she thought of where she stood now, porch light glowing, future stretching out with both risk and promise. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was better. It was Tuesday. The porch wasn't large, just enough for 3 chairs and a small table that had seen better paint. 2 of the chairs carried years of weather, their arms smoothed by use. The third was new, its wood still pale, not yet darkened by sun or rain. It was golden hour in Asheville, the light draped soft across the hills, cicadas beginning their steady chorus. A school flyer lay folded on the table, announcing the launch of a newly funded arts program. Maddie's class would be among the first to benefit. Ellie sat with her daughter beside her, Graham in the new chair. They had made it through a season that had stretched longer than weeks should, marked not just by boardrooms and headlines, but by choices that bent the arc of their lives. Tonight, there was no audience, just pancakes cooling in the kitchen, laundry folded in a basket by the door, and 3 chairs facing the street. They spoke quietly, a debrief of months that felt like years. Ellie recalled the first memo, the buried footnote that had demanded a voice. Graham remembered the worker's spouse who had stood at the gala, thanking Ellie for drills that saved her husband. They laughed at details too small for newspapers, the way the projector had once failed mid-presentation. The night Maddie insisted Graham wash paintbrushes twice because he hadn't done it gently enough. Plans for the weeks ahead came in plain language. More audits, expanded training, another forum scheduled before winter storms set in. Maddie's mural unveiling at school, Ruth's request for someone to help patch her screen door before leaves blew in. Ellie realized the porch itself had become a kind of symbol. Leadership didn't always belong to marble halls or glossy conferences. Sometimes it looked like showing up on a Tuesday, steady and ordinary. Sometimes it looked like 3 chairs, one of them still learning how to weather the seasons. Her heart settled as she watched Maddie chatter about art supplies, her hands waving in the air, glue still faintly smudged on her fingertips. Graham listened, leaning forward, not interrupting, his presence solid but unintrusive. The climax of their story was not a kiss under chandeliers or a headline redeemed. It was this love that never asked Ellie to shrink, leadership that bent toward people, a future shaped by ordinary faithfulness. As twilight deepened, porch lights flicked on, up and down the street. One by one, steady glows appeared, marking homes that chose to keep watch against the dark. Ellie looked at her own porch light, its soft halo spilling onto the steps. She thought of all the thresholds she had crossed the boardroom, where her voice first broke silence. The gala, where lineage was tested. The Seattle terrace, where integrity became confession. None of it had crowned her. None of it had handed her a fairy godmother's wand. What it had given was steadiness, the will to keep a light burning. Graham reached for Maddie's flyer, smoothing the crease. "This program will help a lot of kids," he said. His tone wasn't grand, just matter of fact, the way truth often sounded. Ellie nodded. Change didn't always need applause. Sometimes it only needed to keep going. The twist, if there was one, lay in realizing the comeback that had silenced a room months ago wasn't about words at all. It was a way of leading that made love possible, not through spectacle, but through decisions lived out in plain sight. The porch held them as the night thickened. Maddie grew drowsy, her head leaning against Ellie's shoulder. Graham sat quietly, his chair creaking as he shifted, content to let silence do the work. The future stayed open. There would be wildfire risk meetings next season, expanded drills at remote mills, a school mural unveiling that would draw families and cameras alike. There would be bills to pay, dishes to wash, storms to brace against. But the porch light would still be on. When the cicadas quieted and the street fell hushed, Ellie rose, carrying Maddie inside. Graham followed, pausing only to glance back at the glow spilling from the bulb above the door. It wasn't grand, wasn't meant to be, but it was steady, and for them, that was enough. Life seldom asks us to be ready before it asks us to be brave. Eleanor Hart never set out to be a leader. She was a mother, a secretary, a woman simply trying to keep her household steady. Yet, when faced with a choice between silence and courage, she chose to speak, and in that single act, doors opened she never imagined. Her journey reminds us that real strength is not found in titles or in rooms filled with chandeliers, but in the quiet choices we make when no one expects much of us. Courage doesn't always look like bold speeches. Sometimes it looks like showing up, asking a hard question, or protecting time for family, even when the world demands more. For those of us who have lived long enough to know storms come and go, Ellie's story offers this dignity is built in ordinary acts. The porch light left on for a child, the boundaries set with love, the refusal to shrink even when misunderstood. These are the steady lights that guide a life worth remembering. Perhaps the lesson is simple. Don't wait for permission to live with integrity. Start where you are, speak when it matters, and let courage grow in small, ordinary steps. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with Shining Stories today. If Ellie's journey touched your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who might need a little courage, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep telling stories of resilience, hope, and love. Until next time, may your own light keep shining bright.